Hey everyone, this is Pete, and welcome back to Atari ST A to Z, a series of short playthroughs of Atari ST games, some which I grew up with and some which are new to me. Today is a bit of both really, because I was very familiar with the arcade version of this but never actually played the ST port. Today we're looking at OutRun, which was originally a 1986 release by Sega, and in the arcades it was renowned for its impressive speed, pioneering hardware, smooth graphics and non-linear gameplay, so it was a really revolutionary game in a lot of ways. The ST version is supposedly terrible. I was watching a video by, I think it was Gears of Games the other day, when he made frequent references to the ST version of OutRun being terrible. And my wife, who was watching it with me at the time, said, "But I thought people liked OutRun." And I said, well, yeah, they do, but apparently not the Atari ST version. So I was interested to check it out for myself, because I've never actually seen it. The ST version was developed by Probe and published by US Gold. Now, anyone who was around back in the day will recall that that was a combination of developer and publisher that would make people a little bit wary at the best of times. But I mean, I'm a firm believer in taking a look at things and seeing if they have any merit on their own terms rather than trying to prejudge them too much. So I'm interested to take a look at this. Looking back into reviews at the time, it seems this was actually reviewed quite well when it first came out in publications like ST Action and ST Amiga format. But when it got a budget reissue, a lot of reviewers really laid into it with sort of scores of like 30% and so on. So yeah, it kind of fell from favour pretty quickly, largely because a lot of better games came out in between that time. So what I want to know is it really that bad? Let's go play OutRun.
Okay, here we are with OutRun for Atari ST, supposedly one of the worst arcade conversions there has ever been. I've never actually played this version though, so intrigued to give it a go. I'm always someone who believes in giving stuff a fair chance on its own merits and seeing what we can figure out. So, we start off with this unusual kind of mouse-driven menu. Let's switch to joystick first, and then annoyingly, still using the joystick still uses the sort of drop-down menu system where you move the cursor around using the joystick and then pick what you're going to do. I don't know why they've gone with the drop-down menu thing here. A few developers did this. They kind of sort of assumed that because the ST was a computer that had mouse control, that they absolutely had to use mouse control and drop-down menus and all that sort of thing. There's really no need for it. It's just clunky to navigate in a game situation, but not a deal breaker. Anyway, let's begin. So start. And they're considerably quieter start than the original OutRun in the arcades. And we are off. And a pretty horrendous engine noise. I've heard worse though. I have heard many worse engine noises. Those of you who watched my playthrough of Fastlane from a while back will recall a considerably worse engine noise in that game. At least this one has sort of multiple tones going on, so it makes it a bit more interesting to listen to. And it's also providing a bit of helpful feedback as to when it's the appropriate time to change gear. So controls in this are as you would expect from a racing game on the Atari ST. You have push forward to accelerate and pull back to brake, and you press fire button to switch between low and high gear. Whoops. I just crashed and the people in the car fell out, but they were also still in the car. Okay, so that there is how the iconic split routes are implemented in this. Oh dear, game over. So rather than the actual road splitting into two sections as in the original arcade game, it just divides it down the middle with a row of bushes, and which side of the road that you're on determines which route you're going to take. You know what though? So far I'm not hating this. I mean, it's not amazing, and it's not really OutRun, but taken on its own terms as an Atari ST racing game, I've played many, many worse games than this. I think its biggest problem is that it just doesn't look or feel like OutRun. Which makes me wonder if it was something that maybe Probe had on the go at one point, and then US Gold got the license for OutRun and said, hey, you know that racing game you were working on? Well, if you could just make it into OutRun, that'd be great. It's not unheard of for that sort of thing to happen. Extended play! And the background colour changes. There's those iconic stone bridges from the arcade original. Yeah, so I say I never played this version back in the day. I played Turbo OutRun, and I actually quite liked Turbo OutRun, even though I knew at the time that it was terrible. Turbo OutRun is much worse than this. Turbo OutRun runs at a dreadful frame rate. I mean, this isn't running at an amazing frame rate, but Turbo OutRun's frame rate is just atrocious. And it was obviously atrocious back in the day too. Like, you would look at Turbo OutRun running and you'd think, the ST is capable of much better than this. Particularly when you consider the existence of things like Lotus Esprit Turbo Challenge and that sort of thing. I think the problem with Turbo OutRun is it was trying to do too much. It was trying to put too much trackside detail in there. So it had lots of sprites down the side of the road, which meant that it looked quite nice. And it looked great in still screenshots, but as soon as it started moving, oh dear. Not good. Whereas this, it's not the smoothest, but it's also not terrible. The controls are reasonably responsive. I think one problem we got here is kind of a bit of an issue with the original OutRun rather than necessarily this version, which is that the angle you're looking at the road is very low for a lot of the time, so it's quite difficult to see what's coming up next. And there were quite a few ports of OutRun and other racing games at the time that kind of suffered a bit from this problem. I would assume that once again that happened in a case to try and keep the frame rate up by having less stuff to update on screen at the time. But yeah, it just makes it a little bit difficult to see what you're doing sometimes. Okay, but like I say, not having a terrible time with this, which kind of surprises me, because this version of OutRun is like legendarily awful. But I think what I'm learning from this is that, well, I mean, it's something that I've known for a long time really, which is that it's always worth trying stuff yourself, because it's often worth looking at things that other people have written off. Because in a lot of cases, people write things off based on pure hearsay. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying this is an incredible port or anything like that, or that everyone should rush out and play this version. But I am saying there are far worse racing games on the Atari ST than this. And there are far worse arcade conversions on the Atari ST than this as well. As I say, its biggest problem is that it just doesn't quite look and feel like OutRun. I mean, having this music there helps a bit, but when you have the music, you miss out on having the engine sounds, and the engine sounds are quite helpful feedback for knowing when you should be changing gear. I mean, you've got the rev counter as well, which you can use instead, but it's just a little bit more satisfying and easy to understand what you're doing if you can actually hear the engine as well. But yeah, we got the classic OutRun themes in there. I actually think I prefer it with the sound effects, to be honest. Because I've always found in the case of racing games, playing with just music and no sound effects always makes it feel like you're kind of detached from the experience. Not sure why we suddenly changed tracks there, but there you go. I mean, there's still some sound effects in there, but obviously they interrupt the music. So yeah, but the ST's problem is that it just doesn't have enough sound channels to be able to do the music and the sound effects effectively. I'll say one thing: this is authentically difficult. Right, let's turn the music off again, and let's have another go. Let's also try putting many cars on the roads and see what effect that has as well. So, start. But yeah, actually quite pleasantly surprised by this. I think if I had had a copy of this back in the day, I would have been quite satisfied with this. Because I was very aware that the Atari ST wasn't up to the capabilities of the arcade hardware that was running games like OutRun. I knew that. And so I was happy for something that just sort of... Let's try going right this time. I was happy for something that just sort of approximated the experience at home. Excuse me. And I think I would have been reasonably satisfied with this back then. Equally, I mean, I can see why some people criticise this. The Atari ST is capable of running racing games more smoothly than this. If you look at something like the excellent version of Continental Circus, for example, that's a prime example of how good arcade-style racing games can look on the Atari ST, and how smoothly they can move. Excuse me. This is just a little bit too janky. Yeah, it's just lacking a little something to make it truly special. But that doesn't make it bad. As far as I'm concerned, anyway. It doesn't make it terrible. I mean, I'm still here playing it. I haven't sort of felt the need to throw it down in disgust or anything like that. And as I say, it is way, way better than Turbo OutRun. Which, I'll have to make an effort to have a look at some point, because despite knowing that Turbo OutRun was a mess on Atari ST, I ended up playing it quite a lot. Because I was very fond of arcade-style racing games even back then, and I didn't get the opportunity to go to arcades very often, because, as I've talked about a few times on this series before, here in the UK we don't have the same kind of arcade culture that the United States had. So over here, the only place you'd find an arcade with video games would be at the seaside. And so that meant the only opportunity a lot of us would have to play games like OutRun, Afterburner, all that sort of thing, would be when we went on holiday. And so that meant that these home conversions of arcade games became really important, because they were the only way that a lot of us could experience these games in as butchered a form as they might be in a lot of cases. We kind of took what we could get. Oh dear, I'm doing terribly. But why not play the console version, you might ask? Why not play like the Master System version or something like that? Well, the fact was, at the time, those of us who had invested heavily into the home computer ecosystem didn't necessarily have the money, the time, or the inclination to get involved in consoles. I didn't really have a games console outside of home computers until the Super NES, and I got that quite late, I think. And so home computers weren't cheap at the time. I mean, Atari often marketed their stuff as power without the price, but you were still sort of paying several hundred quid for a computer that would run stuff, and then plus games and software and all sorts of stuff on top of that. And so for a lot of families, the idea of investing in another platform that was just for gaming, that you couldn't do other stuff on as well, was not necessarily the most desirable. I remember my parents taking a fair amount of convincing that a Super NES was a worthwhile investment and something that I really wanted for, I think it was a Christmas I got one for. But my brother kind of helped with that at the time, because he's 10 years older than me, and at the time when I was becoming interested in the home consoles and the Super NES and that sort of stuff, he was working on games magazines. He was working on a multi-format games magazine called Games X at the time, and when he'd come back to visit us, which he did like every few weekends or so, he would often bring back one of the consoles that he had at the office. And I remember on one memorable occasion he brought back a Super NES, or a Super Famicom as it was then, because it hadn't actually been officially released in the UK at that time. It was still the Japanese version. But I remember him bringing that along, and he had copies of, I think it was Gradius 3, Darius, and Super Mario World. And he was obviously super impressed with this piece of tech. I mean, he described it as it being like an arcade machine hooked up to your television, and at the time that very much felt like the case. And it was kind of a whole other world after dealing with the world of 16-bit home computer games. It looks and sounded like this. I mean, as I said, the Atari ST is capable of better than what this game is showing us here. But when it came to like arcade ports and stuff like that, this sort of thing is fairly par for the course. This is typically kind of the level you could expect from an arcade conversion of a technically impressive arcade machine. So like one of Sega's Super Scaler games or something like that. Like Activision did a port of Afterburner that was sort of, I would say that was probably around a similar sort of quality to this. Actually thinking about that, I wonder if Probe did that as well. I can't remember. I do forget. It's been a long time since I played that version of Afterburner. But yeah, anyway, no, I've not had a terrible time with that. I don't hate that at all. As Don't hate it anywhere near as much as I expected to. I'll try and remember to look at Turbo OutRun in a few weeks then, because it will be interesting to compare and contrast that to this version, I think, because Turbo OutRun is the one that I grew up with. Acknowledged was pretty bad at the time, but still enjoyed playing nonetheless, just because of I didn't have any better option to play arcade style races at the time. But yeah, there you go. That is OutRun for Atari ST from Probe and US Gold. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.